country with two peoples living in that country. And so, how do we divide the land? There's two peoples in one country, each that wants self-determination. And the idea is a kind of a partition into two states. Now, it makes sense on paper, and in fact the Palestinians have agreed to the two-state solution. The Arab League unanimously, in 2002, adopted what's called the Arab Peace Initiative. They accept the two-state solution. And it's the international community. I mean, as Libby says, the Canadian government itself is at least on record as supporting a two-state solution. So there is a solution. It's not completely just, obviously, if you look at the map, because in this one country today, half the population is Palestinian. And there will be a Palestinian majority. And then, if even some of the 5 million refugees return that live around Palestine, plus in the diaspora, you'll have a strong Palestinian majority. And yet, the Palestinians have agreed. You know, we never hear about the Palestinians' generous offer. It was probably too generous. And that is, we will make peace with Israel. We, the majority population, for less than a quarter of the land. All the occupied territory, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, represent only 22% of historic Palestine. I don't think there's another colonized people in the world that would give up political claim to 78% of their country in order to make peace and to at least salvage a small state for themselves. We talk here about unceded Algonquin territory. I mean, there are peoples that have been forced to give up their territories, but it's unceded. Here, in a sense, the Palestinians are saying, if you allow us to establish a small state on 22% of our country, we will cede, in a sense, that 78% to Israel. And we will recognize, 27 years ago, the PLO recognized the state of Israel. That's a tremendously generous offer. I don't know another colonized people in the world who would do that. And yet, they've got no credit for it. They've only been demonized as terrorists by Israel and by your government. And Israel has been able to say no. We can't turn off these lights. Somehow, yeah, but then there's no picture. Okay. You can do the video and I can send you the pictures to put in. All right, I'm not going to negotiate. It's a shame to have So, what I'm trying to say then is that the two-state solution is a solution, was a solution, but it's gone. There was one holdup. The Palestinian, the PLO recognized it, the Arab League recognized it, Canada recognized it, the international community, the United States, the two-state solution. There was one holdout, and that's successive Israeli governments that have said no. And not only said no, but have laid over the Palestinian territory what I call a matrix of control. In other words, facts on the ground. That's the term we use in Israel. Facts on the ground that incorporate the West Bank and East Jerusalem into Israel, and that are so massive and so permanent that there'll never ever be the possibility of detaching a coherent territory that could become a Palestinian state. In other words, Israel deliberately, systematically, and consciously, over decades, created facts on the ground with the intention of eliminating the two-state solution. And it's a small territory, and after 47 years, in my view, they succeeded. It's not hard to do, and what it's done, just really quickly, is to fragment the Palestinian territory. There is no more West Bank. There certainly is no more East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem was annexed formally into Israel back in 1967. It doesn't exist from an Israeli point of view, or from a Canadian government point of view. The West Bank has been fragmented into about 70 little tiny islands. In other words, the Palestinians have all been shoved into what we call areas A and B. A and B here, because of the lights you don't see B, but B is, what can I do? B is here. There's part, at any rate, areas A and B that represent about 38% of the occupied territory, including Gaza. Gaza is a kind of a cage down here. So 95% of the Palestinians have been shoved out of their villages, off their lands, in what's called Area C. The 62% of the West Bank that surrounds these islands have been shoved so that today 95% of the Palestinians live on 38% of 22% of their historic homeland. And that, again, fragmented into islands, all surrounded by checkpoints, about 600 checkpoints. Now, if you have millions of Palestinians every day going through checkpoints, you get pretty good at technologies like biometrics, reading eyes, facial recognition, body recognition, voice recognition systems that are all brought into your cities and are used by your police forces. These are technologies that have come into your airports, into your police forces, into everyday use, so that the checkpoints aren't simply to hinder Palestinian movement, but again, they're part of the laboratory that is the occupied territory. And then, it's hard to see, I'm not going to keep harping on that, but it's hard to see, that you've got all these blue areas inside here, about 200 Israeli settlements in Area C, more than 500,000 Israelis living in Area C. Plus a whole system of highways, 28 major highways, many of them off limits to Palestinians, only for Israeli traffic, that then link the West Bank settlements into Israel proper. So that the idea of a two-state solution is a kind of a north-south axis. There's Israel, and alongside Israel, the state of Palestine. So what Israel has done is to create all kinds of cross-cutting highways and settlements and so on that destroy that coherent territory that the Palestinians would have had, and again incorporate the entire country. You know, to go from the settlements in the Jordan Valley into Tel Aviv on this highway, if you're an Israeli, takes about half an hour. You zip right through. So that this has really been incorporated. And then simply to put everything in concrete, in case we still haven't got the point, in case we still don't see where Israel's going in terms of destroying the two-state solution, Israel has built the wall. This wall is more than twice the height of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was a little wall. It was only 12 feet high. This wall is 26 feet high. It's 5 times longer than the Berlin Wall was. Right? And the Berlin Wall was linear. This wall actually incorporates, encloses, imprisons tens of thousands of Palestinians in cells. And what you can see by the wall is the intent. It's not for security. You see, it's sold as security. But it has nothing to do with that. The official name of the wall is the separation barrier. It's an apartheid wall, and Israel uses the word apartheid. say it in Hebrew instead of in Afrikaans. Apartheid in Hebrew is hafrada. Hafrada is separation. The official name of the wall is Michshol hafrada, which means the separation barrier. And you just have to look at the root of the wall to get it. It hugs areas A and B, you see, so it creates what Israel calls cantons. There's a canton in the north, a canton, a little canton in the center, a canton in the south, and then Gaza, which is a cage. And on the other side of the wall, you see, these reddish areas here are what Israel calls its settlement blocks. The big blocks of the major settlements that Israel will definitely incorporate. So when the wall hits the settlement block, it goes around it. You can't tell me the wall comes to here for security reasons. It's obvious it's not security, it's a land grab. And you see the wall, you see how it incorporates all kinds of villages and towns of Palestinians into cells, including Greater Jerusalem here, so that this part of the wall is called by Israel its demographic border. How's that for a concept, for a democracy? This is the demographic. Israel has two eastern borders, which is interesting since there's only one east. One is the demographic border here, and the other one is the Jordan River, which is Israel's security border. And in between these two borders are squeezed the Palestinians. So, from my point of view, from looking at the facts on the ground, and this is Israeli intention. I didn't make up this map. It's not my line on the wall. This is done intentionally by Israel, permanently. You're not going to tell me that this is some temporary little barrier. It costs billions of dollars. And it's being exported. You have walls in Iraq. You have walls on the U.S.-Mexican border. There's some technologies that have certainly been put in with Elbit systems on the American and the United States-Canadian border. So this is being replicated, not necessarily in concrete, but the surveillance systems around it, the monitoring systems, the drones that are used are being brought to many other countries. And there's a very interesting article by a fellow named Jimmy Johnson that's called The Palestine-Mexican Border. Where he really shows how this border has been transposed along the border between Mexico and the United States. So, just to kind of show you, to kind of get us in a little bit more into actually how the occupation works, I want to go with this idea, to walk you through Salim. Some of you know Salim, through some of his demolitions. I'm not going to go through all 6, but I think it really begins to uncover the layers of occupation. And the idea of house demolitions is, of course, that Palestinians live, most of them, many of them, in areas, what's called Area C. So the idea is to displace them and to shove them into A and B. Since 1948, since 1948, Israel's demolished somewhere around 120,000 Palestinian homes. We're talking about entire villages, urban areas, towns. Since 1967, since the occupation began, about 48,000 homes have been demolished in the occupied territory. Just this summer, in July, August, in the assault on Gaza, those 2 months, 18,000 homes were demolished. So there's no connection in that sense between security and home demolitions. They're not targeted, especially in military invasions, they're not targeted. They're simply collateral damage. They're in the way of Israeli military attacks. The other side of the house demolition issue is that Israel wants to displace the Palestinians and either get them out of the country in general, especially middle-class people, or to confine them to areas A and B. And so it uses the house demolition issue as a way of doing that. This is the Shawamri family. You don't see so well, but anyway. So this is the Shawamri family. This is Salim, the shadow of Salim, Arabia, and their 7 kids who live in Anata. Anata is a town next to Jerusalem. Since we're in a church, we should mention that Anata, where this is happening, in the Bible is Anatot, which is the hometown of the prophet Jeremiah. Now, you would really have a Jeremiah if Jeremiah would see what was happening in his hometown. At any rate, Anata is a small town, about 18,000 people. Part of Anata is in Jerusalem, part of Anata is in area B, and part of Anata is in area C. Each place, you get houses demolished by a different Israeli authority. In area C, it's the civil administration, which is Israel's military government. Okay. Small bit. So Salim and Arabia actually lived in Saudi Arabia, where Salim is an engineer and made a little bit of money. And when the Oslo peace process began, like thousands of other Palestinians, he came home. He and Arabia came home to be a part of rebuilding their country. And they bought a small plot of land in Anata near the Shuafat refugee camp in Jerusalem, where Salim was born. Okay, that's fine. You can buy land. But then you have to apply to the Israeli authorities for a building permit. What's called the civil administration. So language becomes important. Israel calls its military government over the occupied territory a civil administration in order to give the impression of normal, everyday, routine administration with nothing military connected to it. And the civil administration's policy is not to grant building permits to Palestinians for the last 47 years. How is that done? In other words, how can Israel deny housing to an entire population and still present itself as the only democracy in the Middle East? Well, the mechanism is very interesting. What Israel's done is it's taken dry, gray, Kafkaesque bureaucratic mechanisms and made them the mechanisms of control. So the entire West Bank has been zoned as agricultural land. You see, even though we'll see a lot of it is desert, especially where Salim lives, the Judean desert, nevertheless is agricultural land. So when a family like the Shawamris apply for a permit, a Palestinian family, the answer is, sorry, this is zoned as agricultural land, you can't build it. And if I was the Israeli ambassador, somewhere in this city, I would say to you with a straight face, this is non-discriminatory. This applies to Jews as well as to Arabs, which is true, with one little twist. That is, look, you say, well, okay, Salim can't build, fine, it's agricultural land. But you've got 200 settlements in the same land. In other words, here's Salim's house. Right here is Salim's house. And right here is one of the largest settlements in the West Bank, called Ma'ale Adumim, with close to 50,000 people. So wait, why can't Salim build here because it's agricultural, and you got 50,000 Israelis living here? Well, it's simple. Israelis sit on the planning commission. It's as simple as that. And if you want to rezone from agriculture to residential, it takes you a second if you want to do it. It's a good example of what's called partisan planning. And it's how Israel conceals its political agenda under this veneer of proper, technical, almost benign planning. So, Salim applied 3 times for a permit. Each time it cost him $5,000 to apply. Now, 70% of the Palestinians live under the poverty line. So, obviously they couldn't afford it. He happened to have a little nest egg from Saudi Arabia, but he didn't get it. And it's like a lottery, very much like a lottery. In other words, Israel granted last year, there's 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. Israel granted 18 building permits. So it's really at the level of a lottery. But it's enough, you know, you have a lottery here. I have bad news for you, you're not going to win. But you play it anyway. I mean, it generates millions of dollars. The same is true here. It sucks you into the system. You hope that maybe you'll get the permit, you're a good guy, you have a lawyer friend, you know some Israeli, you know, but basically, it's a policy of not granting building permits. Therefore, Salim and Arabia, like thousands of other Palestinian families, had to build a home for themselves, a modest home on their own land, without a permit. And immediately they got a demolition order from the civil administration. Now, Palestinians do a kind of a cold calculation. There's so many thousands of homes waiting to be demolished that have orders. Maybe I'll get lost in the shuffle. Or maybe I'll live for a year in my home before they come. Maybe I'll live for 5 years. Maybe I'll win the lottery and they'll never come. So you build hoping that something's going to happen. I've talked to many Palestinian women who tell me the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is I look out the window to see if there's police, bulldozers, the army. And if the coast is clear, I get dressed and I wake up the kids and I start making breakfast. That's how people begin their day in the Palestinian areas. And in fact, the family lived for 5 years in their home. One day, July 1998, they're having lunch in the middle of the day, and there's a knock on the door. Now, I don't know what civil servants look like in Hollywood. But this is what they look like if you're a Palestinian. This is Rami. This is Micha, accompanied by hundreds of soldiers. Okay. Now, civil employees, right? This is a civil administration. Not completely civilian, but pretty civilian. Who are they? What Israeli civilians can work for the civil administration? It's located in the middle of the West Bank, to the east of Ramallah. The only Israelis that can get there are settlers. So here you have 2 settlers living on stolen Palestinian land, unceded, ideologically committed to getting Arabs out of our country, who are put in a position of power to decide which family is going to have a house and who doesn't, who's going to get demolished. There's a knock on the door. Salim answers. Rami says to him, "Is this your house?" Salim says, "Yes, it's my house." He says, "No, it isn't. It's our house now. You got 15 minutes to get all your belongings out. We're going to demolish it." Now, what would you do? This is your home. You're not a terrorist. You see, this is again why the house demolition is so powerful. There's nothing here terroristic. He's not being arrested. He's not being charged. Nothing about security. So you would argue, what would you do if someone came to demolish your house? And the minute you begin to argue, to protest, it becomes resistance. The soldiers are not there just for decoration. And Salim was beaten and thrown out of his home. called us. We happened to be nearby, our Committee Against House Demolitions, activists, and we managed to get to the house. The soldiers broke the windows of the house and threw in tear gas cans to flush out the family. I don't know if you ever had a whiff of tear gas outside, but it's pretty powerful stuff. Inside, it's overwhelming. Then they broke in the door. Arabia was carried out unconscious. The kids were running and screaming in every direction. This is a trauma that's going to stay with this family forever. The humiliation, the violence, the tear gas, just the noise of the violence. Your home being demolished. So a house demolition is not like it happens, too bad, and the next day you get on with your life. This is something that lasts with this family forever. Now multiply this 48,000 times, and you begin to get an idea of the trauma and the impact on Palestinian society. We get into the color's weird. I don't have a green beard.
Looks good on you.
This guy looks like an alien. But we come in, if we, again, if we can get there in time, we chain ourselves in houses. In other words, as Israeli Jews, we have a privileged position. They're not going to shoot us, or beat us up, or put us in jail. We get arrested all the time, but they don't really put us in jail. So we're able to resist in ways that it's hard for Palestinians to do. We chain ourselves in houses, we get on the roof, we get in front of bulldozers, which is why I'm built this way. And we resist. We're calling diplomats, we're calling journalists. At one point, until a few years ago, the Canadian representative office in Ramallah was wonderful. They were responsive, they were there, and the Americans as well. Today, less. So finally then, we're out of the house, the family's out of the house. So the civil administration simply subcontracts to commercial companies. If you own a company, a little bulldozer, you can apply for a contract to demolish Palestinian homes. So Rami says to the contractor, throw everything out, you got 5 minutes. Whatever you can throw out, whatever you can't, don't worry about it, we'll simply demolish on top. And you can see how everything is torn out. The kitchen cabinets, your papers are flying. I mean, imagine your home, trying to empty your home in a few minutes. And everything is torn out, and it's this feeling of invasion. And then the bulldozer comes to demolish the home. It comes through the wall that Salim built, through the garden that he planted, and begins to demolish the home. Here there's a kind of a tragedy within a tragedy. The driver of the bulldozer happens to be a Palestinian. He's just a guy that works for this company. One day he'll come to work and he's sent to build a road. The next day he'll demolish a home. And he was a friend of Salim's. So you can imagine what's going on in his mind as he's demolishing his friend's home. Salim is watching this happening, lying on the ground. Again, nothing about terrorism. If he was a terrorist, he wouldn't be lying on the ground. So there's nothing security in this. Because if you go out, I challenge you, you go out on the street, outside, and ask anybody, why is Israel demolishing Palestinian homes? First of all, people don't know. But if you think about it for 30 seconds, the answer is clear. They're terrorists.
Absolutely.
That's the only answer Israel leaves you with. Well, we can see